Okay, so hello everyone, thank you all for joining. My name is Dan, I work as an Android engineer at Five in Zagreb, Croatia, and today I'll talk about implementing a splash screen in Android. So let's start. Before I start talking about splash screen, let's first take a look at a couple of pictures of some of the hotel lobbies of some of the world's best hotels. So this is an example of one hotel lobby, this is an example of another one, and this is an example of another one. So what do all of these three pictures have in common? So all of these three hotel lobbies are modern, luxurious, and they simply look amazing. So why do the hotel owners invest so many resources into making hotel lobbies look great? So aren't actually the guest rooms the most important rooms in every hotel? Well, they are, but the hotel lobbies are the second most important rooms. And why is that? Because the first impressions matter. So with any introduction to people, places, or products, first impressions are critical. Some research have shown that it only takes 50 milliseconds for users to form a first impression of your product. For this reason, it's vital that your first impression is always your best one. So let's now move on to a splash screen and let's see what do splash screens and hotel lobbies have in common. So if you take a look into the material design documentation, we are going to find this sentence there that says, the launch screen is a user's first experience of your app. So what does this mean? Let's take a look at an example. So we have our home screen, user tabs, and app icon, and before the initial screen of the app is shown, for a very short period of time, we see some screen with white background and an app icon. So this is a splash screen. So splash screen is the very first screen the user sees when they open up an app on a mobile device. Splash screen appears while the app is loading when the user has just opened up the app. As we've seen in the material design documentation, splash screen is often called a launch screen, but for the purposes of this presentation, we are going to stick to the splash screen naming. Splash screen mostly consists of a logo, brand name, or some slogan, and it is minimalistic in nature. So I said that the splash screen is shown while the app is loading. So let's first take a look into the app startup. Again, let's take a look at an example. So we are on our home screen, user tabs and app icon, and app starts to load. So the app loading takes some time depending on the device resources and on the app size. And when the app is fully loaded, we see the initial screen of our application. So this is how this process works on a technical side. So in the user tabs and app icon, the system does a bit of work to load your application information and to launch your application. Immediately, system process displays a start window that basically hangs around until your app is fully loaded. In the meantime, application process creates an application object and it creates a main thread for your application. This is where your activity gets initialized, inflated, created, and drawn, and it's only at this point, after your activity is ready to draw its first frame, that the system process swaps the start window for the application window. So the splash screen is visible from when start window is displayed until the start window is removed. App launch can take place in one of three states. Each state affects how long it takes for your app to become visible to the user. These startup states are cold start, warm start, and hot start. So let's briefly take a look into each of them. So during the cold start, your app is starting from scratch. So cold start happens when your app is being launched for the first time, and cold start is perfect for showing a splash screen because cold start takes the longest and the splash screen gives the impression of a shorter delay. Then we have the warm start. So warm start encompasses some subset of the operations that take place during the cold start. So during the warm start, the system does not need to initialize everything, but it has lost some information and needs to reload it. So the warm start doesn't take as long as the cold start, but it's often long enough to show a splash screen. And finally, we have a hot start. So during the hot start, all the system does is bring your activity to the foreground, and for this reason, hot start is quick and it leaves no time for a splash screen. So let's now take a look at the history of splash screens. So splash screens were once viewed as an anti-pattern. Developers often misused splash screens as a way to embed branding into applications. This caused intentionally delaying users from reaching the content of your app for a few seconds. Later on, as Android evolved and app requirements grew, the time taken to launch apps began to increase, and for this reason, the material design guidelines started recommending a splash screen. However, there was a problem that there was lack of documentation, so there were no any official guides and examples on how to implement a splash screen on Android. So this led to having multiple approaches of adding a splash screen, some better one, some worse one, user experience-wise. Also, no APIs or libraries existed to ensure consistency across code bases. With the Android 12, things have changed. So Android 12 brought a new SplashScreen API, and there were also some behavioral changes. So starting from Android 12, all apps show a default splash screen. SplashScreen API is backwards compatible, but only to a certain extent. So some features are not available on the older versions, but we are going to see this at an example later on. So what is the idea behind this new SplashScreen API? So with the SplashScreen API introduction, Android framework became opinionated on how to implement SplashScreen on Android. So framework being opinionated means that it only allows you to do things in a certain way, that is, it makes all other ways much more difficult. So idea behind SplashScreen API is to have a standard and consistent implementation across all devices and operating systems. SplashScreen API also aims to reduce boilerplate code, and SplashScreen API provides branding and animation support, which is pretty important for these splash screens. Okay, so now when we know the theory, let's actually create a splash screen using the SplashScreen API. So we'll start with a completely empty project. So all I did, I created a new Android Studio project. I didn't done any changes to the code base, and I ran that app. So when I run that app on the Android 12 or above versions, we can see that default splash screen is shown. So before the initial screen of the app is shown, for a short period of time, we see some screen with white background and app logo. So that's the default splash screen. If I run the same application on an older version, I can see that there is no splash screen. So let's actually customize our splash screen and let's make it look consistent across all Android versions. If we take a look into the SplashScreen API implementation, we are going to find a SplashScreen class there. SplashScreen class provides control over the splash screen once the application is started. If we take a look into the implementation of the SplashScreen class, we are going to find out that it has two implementations. One implementation for API 31 and above, and one implementation for the older versions. So on API 31, this class calls the platform methods, while on the older versions, the platform behavior is replicated. So there is a SplashScreen compat library that basically wraps the SplashScreen API. So SplashScreen compat library tries to replicate as much of the platform behavior as possible on the older versions. So to start customizing our splash screen, first thing that we have to do, we need to add a dependency to the SplashScreen library. And now we are ready for customizing the splash screen. But what exactly can we customize? We can customize a couple of things. We can customize the appearance of the splash screen. We can choose to keep the splash screen on screen for a longer period. And we can customize the animation for dismissing the splash screen. When it comes to the appearance, we can customize a couple of things. We can customize the splash icon. We can customize the icon background. We can customize the splash screen background, and optionally, we can add a branding logo at the bottom of the splash screen. So let's start with the icon. Let's add a custom icon to our splash screen. When it comes to the icon, icon can be any vector drawable or PNG. By default, if you do not specify our custom icon, splash screen will use the launcher icon. However, there are some rules that our custom icon needs to follow. So splash screen icon needs to follow the same rules as the adaptive icon. So this means that the icon needs to fit within a circle whose diameter is 2/3 of the size of the icon. So this means that the 1/3 of the icon size is reserved for the mask. So icon is masked using system mask. So some systems like Pixel use circle mask, some systems like Samsung use squircle mask, and some systems use rounded corner shape mask. When it comes to the splash screen icon, you shouldn't be using adaptive icon directly, because adaptive icon is already masked, which basically means that will get cropped 2 times. So instead, you should just use the foreground part of the adaptive icon and set the background separately. When it comes to the size of the splash screen icon, we can have 2 scenarios. The first one is that our icon can have an icon background. If our icon has an icon background, the splash screen icon size is 240 dp. So we said that the 1/3 is reserved for the mask. This means that the actual icon size is going to be 160 dp. The other scenario is that we do not have an icon background. In this case, the values are slightly different. So in this case, the icon size is 288 dp, and again, if the 1/3 of the icon size is reserved for the mask, the actual size of the icon is 192 dp. So the thing with these values is that these values are not customizable. So the system uses these values for the icon size, and you cannot modify these values. So you do not have control over the splash icon size. So no matter which size of the icon you provide for the splash screen, the system will scale your icon to exactly these values. So for this reason, the actual values don't really matter if you use a vector icon. So for example, if you use vector icon, the system will scale the icon to these values, which will result in a no loss of quality. However, you need to make sure that when your icon is scaled to these values, that it uses the correct aspect ratio and that the scaling doesn't result in a loss of quality, which might happen if you use a PNG. So the splash screen library provides 2 themes, theme.splashscreen and theme.splashscreen.icon background. Splash screen theme defines splash screen attributes that are common to all versions, while the splash screen.icon background theme should be used if you wish to display a background under your icon. So this theme extends from the theme.splashscreen. Okay, to actually add our custom splash icon, there are a couple of steps that we need to do. First, we need to define a style for our splash screen. Then we need to define which icon do we want to use for our splash screen. Then we need to define a post splash screen theme. So in the step 1, we define a style for our splash screen. So this is a style that will be applied only to the splash screen. When the splash screen is dismissed, we no longer want to use this style. So that's why we need to define which style do we want to use after the splash screen is dismissed. Then we need to set the splash style to the initial activity of our application. And finally, we need to install the splash screen. We are going to see what this means. So step number 1, let's define the splash screen style. To define a style for our splash screen, you define it basically as you would define any other style, but it needs to extend from one of the themes that the SplashScreen API provides. So initially, we are extending from theme.splashscreen because we are not going to add an icon background initially. So setting these style attributes changes the splash screen appearance. You'll notice that there are some attributes that have this Android prefix. These attributes are only for API 31, so these attributes are not available on the older API versions. To define the splash icon, we need to use Windows splash screen animated icon attribute, and the value for it is the drawable that we want to use as our splash icon. So despite the name, the icon doesn't need to be animated. So initially, we are just pointing to some regular drawable, so to some static drawable file. However, on API 31, this can be an animated icon. So this means that we can provide animated vector drawable as a value for this attribute. Next, we need to define post splash screen theme. So the theme that we want to use after the splash screen is dismissed. To define post splash screen theme, we use post splash screen theme attribute, which defines which theme is going to be applied to the activity once the splash screen is dismissed. So here I'm using simply an application theme that was added by default when I created a new project. Next, we need to set the splash style. So we set the style in the manifest file by using the theme attribute. The thing here is that we can set the theme attribute either of the whole application or just the starting activity to the splash screen style that we have defined. So behavior should be the same. I prefer adding to the starting activity. And the last step, we need to install the splash screen. So in the onCreate method of the starting activity, we need to call install splash screen method to install the splash screen. But what does it mean to install a splash screen? So install splash screen method basically creates a splash screen instance that's associated with that activity, and this method handles setting the theme to the post splash screen theme that we have defined. So this is the main job of this install splash screen method. The thing with this method is that it needs to be called before set content view or any other view operations on the root view. So to install the splash screen, I call install splash screen method in the onCreate. This method returns a splash screen instance, and I assign the splash screen reference to a val to use it later for extra customization. And this is it. I added my custom splash screen icon, and if I run my app on API 31 and on the older version, this is the result that I get. So the icon is displayed on all API versions. However, I can see that it is cropped. So what's the problem? Let's take a look at the icon that we are using for the splash screen in the Android Studio. So what's the problem here? I said that the icon needs to follow the adaptive icon rules. So this means that the 1/3 of the icon size is reserved for the mask. As we can see here, there's no enough space for the mask, and the mask crops the icon. So how can we fix this? Well, we can fix this pretty simply by scaling our icon down. To scale the icon down, we can wrap the icon path in the group attribute, and we can use scale X and scale Y attributes to scale the icon down. So I'm scaling the icon down by half, and this is the result that I get. So we can see that there's now more than enough room for the mask. And if I run my application now, this is the result that I get on API 31 and on the older version. So we can see that our icon is not cropped anymore. Now, to actually check if your icon is going to fit the splash screen without actually running your app, you can add a debug group to your icon. So by adding a debug group, I simply mean by adding two layers. The square layer, whose size is 2/3 of the icon size, and the circle layer on top of the square layer, whose diameter is again 2/3 of the icon size. And if our icon fits within this circle, this means it will fit the splash screen as well. So the mask will not crop it. Now, if you are using Android Studio to test the splash screen, you will notice some issues here. So SplashScreen API on Android 12 shows blank screen when launched via third-party launchers, app info, and from IDE. Why is that? Because by default, splash screen isn't shown. So the launcher actually sets a special flag that shows the splash screen. So for this reason, splash screen is not displayed if you, for example, launch an app from a deep link. Now, as we all know that the Android Studio runs apps using ADB, this is considered as a launch from another app, not a launcher, and for this reason, we do not see a splash screen when launching our app from Android Studio. Now, there is an open issue for this on the issue tracker. It says that it's fixed and that it will be available in one of the upcoming versions, but for now, it's still not fixed. Okay, we've added custom icon, our custom splash screen icon. So let's now move on to adding the custom splash screen background. The background is simply the background color of the splash screen. We change the splash screen background using the window splash screen background attribute. If we do not specify this attribute, the default value that's used is the value from theme's window background attribute. Now, the restriction here is that we need to use single opaque color, so no gradients or no semi-transparent colors are allowed here. To add a splash screen background, as we said, we simply use window splash screen background attribute. The value is the color that we want to use. For the splash screen, I chose some gray color, and if I run the application on API 31 and on the older version, this is the result that I get. And this is it regarding the splash screen background. Next, let's add an icon background. So the icon background is an optional color that's displayed below the icon. Design guidelines recommend adding an icon background if you need more contrast between the icon and the window background. To add an icon background, first thing that we have to do, we need to change the theme. So to enable the icon background, Splash team needs a different parent. Our splash screen team needs to extend from team.splashscreen.icon background. So icon background theme ensures that the scale and masking of the icon are similar to the Android 12 splash screen. To add an icon background, we need to use Windows splash screen icon background color attribute that basically sets a color behind the splash screen icon. So I choose some green color for the icon background color, and if I run the application now, I can see that the icon background is displayed on API 31 and on the older versions. And the last thing that we are going to customize regarding the appearance of the splash screen is the branding image. So optionally, you can choose to set an image that's going to be shown at the bottom of the splash screen. So the thing here is that you cannot change the position of the branding image. You do not have control over the position. The branding image is displayed at the bottom of the splash screen, and you cannot modify this behavior. Now, the design guidelines recommend against using a branding image. However, SplashScreen API allows you to add it. The thing with the branding images is that it's only supported on API 31, so you cannot have a branding image on the older API versions. And the size of the branding image is 200 by 80 dp. So again, same with the splash icon, this is the size that the system uses, and you do not have control over this size. So no matter which icon size you provide, the system is going to scale the icon to these values. So again, for this reason, the recommendation is to use vector asset to prevent loss of quality when the image is scaled. Now to add a branding image, first thing that we have to do, we have to create a new style for the Android 12 because the branding image is not supported on API, on the older API versions. So we need to create a new resource directory with the API 31 qualifier, and we add a copy of the theme that we declared earlier for our splash screen. And we only append the Windows splash screen branding image attribute, and the value of this attribute is the drawable file that we want to use for the splash screen, for the branding image. Now the Windows splash screen branding image attribute places a drawable image in the bottom of the starting menu. So again, we do not have control over the position of the branding image. And if I run the application now, this is the result that I get on API 31 and on the older version. So on the older version, everything remained the same. However, on API 31, we can see that our branding image is displayed. However, we can see that the aspect ratio of the branding image is not right. So what's the problem here? So as we said, the branding image has a specific size that the system uses, and our icon was scaled to that value. And when scaling, the icon didn't keep an aspect ratio. So how can we fix this? Now there's a trick that you can use to keep an aspect ratio of a vector drawable. So basically, you can center a vector drawable in a layer list, and that will preserve an aspect ratio. So you create a new drawable file with the layer list as the root element. You add one item to it, point it to a drawable that you use for the branding image, and you set gravity attribute to center. So this will keep an aspect ratio of the vector drawable. And also you need to change Windows splash screen branding image attribute to point to this new layer list drawable that we've just created. And if we run the application now, this is the result that we get on API 31 and on the older versions. And that's it regarding the customizing the appearance of the splash screen. So let's now move on to animating the splash screen. So when it comes to the splash screen animations, there are a couple of animations involved here. The first one is the enter animation. Enter animation is the animation that's run when user taps the app icon. So this animation is controlled with the system and it is not customizable. Then when the splash screen appears, the only thing that we can customize here is the logo. So we can provide our own custom logo animation. And when the splash screen is dismissed, the exit animation plays. So the exit animation is an animation that's run that hides the splash screen, and this animation can also be customized. So let's add an animated icon first. So first thing, why would we add an animated icon? So animated icon has aesthetic appeal, it provides a more premium experience, and some user research have shown that the perceived startup time is actually less when viewing an animation. The thing with the animated icon, however, is that it's only supported on API 31, so you cannot have animated icon on the older API versions. To add an animated icon, we use the same attribute as when we added a regular icon, so that's the window SplashScreen animated icon attribute. However, the difference is that now we provide an animated vector drawable instead of the regular drawable. So when you provide animated vector drawable as the value for this attribute, your animation will automatically be played. And another attribute that you can use when adding an animated icon is the window SplashScreen animation duration attribute. So this attribute sets the duration in milliseconds of the splash screen icon, and the recommendation is not to exceed 1000 milliseconds here. But this attribute does not actually affect the duration of the animation. So the duration of the animation is set by the animated vector drawable itself. So this attribute is used that you can tell yourself how long the animation takes. So this is the value that you can fetch from the code. And then, for example, you can use this value to calculate how much time has remained for your animation to come to the end. And then you can choose to keep the splash screen visible until your animation is finished. And we've added an animated icon. And if we run the application now, this is the result that we get on API 31. So we can see that the icon is animated. It animates from the white color to the black color. On the older version, everything has remained the same. Now let's add an exit animation. So you can customize the exit animation of the splash screen that is run once the app is loaded. To customize the exit animation, we need an access to the splash screen view and to the splash screen icon view, and then we can run animations on these two views. The thing with exit animation is that the splash screen needs to be manually removed when we add an exit animation. And exit animation, unlike the icon animation, is backwards compatible. So when it comes to adding an exit animation to the splash screen, the key component here is onExit animation listener. So this is the listener that will be called once the splash screen is ready to be removed. This listener has one method, onSplashScreenExit. This is the callback that's going to be called when the splash screen is ready to be dismissed. And inside of this callback, the caller must remove the splash screen once it's done with it. This method takes one parameter, and that's the splash screen view provider object. So this object holds a reference to the displayed splash screen, and it contains the time information about the animated icon. Also, this object provides references to the splash screen view and to the icon view. So to add an exit animation, we need to call setOnExitAnimationListener on the splash screen instance. And first thing that we have to do, we have to get references to the splash screen view and to the icon view. So splash screen view is basically the view that represents the splash screen, and the icon view is the view that represents the splash screen icon. So this is the icon that we have defined with the window splash screen animated icon attribute. So now when we have references to these two views, we can run animations on them as we would do with any other views. So I'm not going to go through this code block line by line because there's nothing SplashScreen API specific here. So this is pure animation code. I define some alpha animation for the splash screen background, and I define some translate up animation for the splash screen icon. The only thing that's the splash screen specific here is in the animator set do an end block where I remove the splash screen. So once the animation is finished, we need to remove the splash screen from view hierarchy. We do that by calling the remove method on the splash screen view provider, which always needs to be called when onExitAnimationListener is set. And if I run the application now, I can see that the exit animation is displayed on API 31 and on the older versions. So the splash screen background fades out and the icon translates up. And that's it that the SplashScreen API provides regarding the animations. However, there are some other common requirements that you may get when implementing a splash screen. The one requirement that you may get is to add a Lottie animation to the splash screen. So it's not possible to use Lottie animation directly with the SplashScreen API. However, there is a workaround. So to add a Lottie animation, first thing that you have to do, you have to take the first frame of the animation and convert it to SVG. Then you import that SVG into Android Studio. Then you add Lottie animation to the initial activity, and here you need to ensure that the Lottie animation view is aligned with the splash screen icon. And the last step is to synchronize the end of the splash screen animation with the start of Lottie animation. So this basically creates an effect of seamless transition from the splash screen to the initial screen of your application. From the user's perspective, everything seems that it looks like that everything happens on the same screen. And the other common requirement that you may get when adding a splash screen is to add shared element transition animation. So again, the same as with Lottie animation, it's not possible to use shared element transition animation directly with the SplashScreen API. However, workaround is similar to the Lottie animation. So you basically add the shared element to the initial activity and you ensure that the element is aligned with the element on the splash screen. Then you synchronize the end of the splash screen with the start of the element animation, which basically again creates an effect of seamless transition from the splash screen to the initial screen. However, the disclaimer here is don't do that. So from the user experience side, this is considered bad. So the application start should be as fast as possible and the splash screen should be dismissed as soon as you have some content to display. So remember, letting users wait on fancy but useless animation is simply against good user experience. So no one wants to watch your splash screen longer than necessary. And finally, let's take a look at the legacy methods that were used for implementing a splash screen before the SplashScreen API was available. So there were two most common approaches used: launcher theme and splash activity. So when it comes to the launcher theme approach, this is how it works. So during the cold start, the window manager tries to draw a default placeholder UI using the attributes from the apps theme. One of the attributes that it uses is the window background attribute, and basically you can customize the splash screen by setting some other value for this attribute. So with this approach, splash screen is only shown when needed. So you are not introducing any additional intentional delays. However, the downside is that this approach is not flexible. So for example, you cannot add animations to the splash screen with this approach. The other approach includes having a dedicated splash screen activity that basically shows up for a fixed amount of time, after which you navigate to the actual initial activity of your application. So this approach offers more flexibility. So here you can do anything that you can do in the regular activity. So you can have custom views, you can have animations, whatever. However, the problem with this approach is that it introduces additional delay. And on the Android 12 and above, if you have a custom splash activity, your app will have two splash screens. So let's take a look at this at an example. So let's say you have a custom dedicated splash activity and you run your app on the Android 12 or above. So the user taps an app icon, the app starts to load, and the system splash screen is displayed. After the app is fully loaded, the initial screen of the app is shown, which in this case is the custom splash screen implementation that you have. So this screen hangs around for a fixed amount of time that you specified, after which it navigates to the actual initial screen of your application. So with this approach, you have two splash screens on the Android 12 and you're adding additional intentional delay to your application. Also, if your target SDK is 31 or above, Android Studio will issue a warning if you have a custom splash screen implementation. So basically this warning is triggered if you use a word splash in the activity name, and this is basically Android Studio telling you that you should migrate to the new SplashScreen API. And yeah, with this we've come to an end, so let's see what we have covered. So we've seen that the splash screen is a critical aspect of the user experience. We've seen how to use the SplashScreen API to provide a smooth experience for users. And we take a look at the legacy methods that were used for implementing a splash screen before the SplashScreen API was available. So the key thing that you should remember here that you should test your existing projects to ensure that they are compatible with the Android 12. Now, all of the screenshots and all the code samples that I've shown in the presentation are from the sample app that I created only for this presentation. So I'll share the slides after the talk on my Twitter account, and you can take a look into the sample app and play around with the splash screen. And yeah, this is it. Thank you all for listening, and if there are any questions, please